Welcome to My Business Matters, the Michigan Chamber podcast.
Hi, I'm Wendy Block, Senior Vice President of Business Advocacy and Member Engagement for the Michigan Chamber and host of today's My Business Matters podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by three very esteemed guests. First is the Senate's new Appropriations Chair, Senator Sarah Anthony. Our second guest is the new chair of Michigan's House Appropriations Committee and a small business leader, Angela Whitwer. And our third guest is State Budget Director and Governor Whitmer's budget lead, Chris Harkins. So there is so much ground for us to cover today, and I'm going to get us right going into some questions. So I want to start with just a high-level question for each of you to kind of quickly jump in on. Representative Whitwer, I'll start with you. This is, and the same kind of question to you, Senator Anthony, when we get to you. This is both of your first time chairing the Appropriations Committee. Tell me about just how it's going so far, how you're approaching your new role, maybe what you're expecting to do differently from past chairs or similarly, if you feel like there's a lot of similar things, and what you think the business community, Michiganders, other stakeholders should expect out of you in this new session. So a lot of questions there, but maybe you can pick a couple things.
Thanks, Wendy. First of all, we are excited. Both Senator Anthony and I have already been meeting quite often. We see each other socially, so that is the first difference from last term. And we plan on having a very friendly relationship and work together on putting out the best thing for the people of Michigan. The biggest thing I wanted to bring was historically the sub-chairs didn't do many things, and this term, I plan on empowering the sub-chairs again and letting them lead the process and bringing a lot of transparency back to the budget process. And I'm excited to be able to work with Chris and Senator Anthony on that.
Great. Senator, how about you?
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here.
You know, I think it's interesting that the three of us who are here all live in mid-Michigan. And so, as Rep. Whitwer mentioned, having those constant communication loops, it could be as simple as, hey, I'm across the street. Do you want to discuss something that we saw in the headlines or something we want to work through? So just logistically, you'll see us working really well together. I'm no stranger to appropriations. I served on the committee. I was a staffer back in the day on a subcommittee on appropes. And so I think the one thing I would love to bring to this process is increased transparency. Oftentimes, the people of Michigan aren't really included in meaningful ways as we're building these budgets. But we know that budgets are moral documents, and the decisions that we make in the Capitol impact people's real lives. It's the water they drink, it's the food they have access to, it's our ability to have thriving communities that includes businesses and nonprofits and everything in between. So I'm excited about having a transparent and inclusive process.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you're right. I mean, there is so much mystique or like mystery behind what is the budget process. And I think a lot of people lose sight of the fact that it does impact everyday Michiganders in so many different ways, even if you don't really think it matters to you. Director Harkins, let's talk about your role. So this is your second budget, I believe, for the governor, and you're certainly no strangers to the appropriations process. In fact, none of you are, right? You all have an appropriations background. You served as the director of the Senate Fiscal Agency and have held various budget roles. But tell us how and when your work really gets started, because this all is kind of started in a lot of ways with the governor's budget recommendation that will be coming. And tell us kind of what that is going to look like for you and kind of what that focus is as you start crafting, if you haven't already, this next year's budget recommendations.
Sure, Wendy. Thanks for having me. And you're right. We work most of the year to develop the governor's budget proposals and then work with the legislative partners to effectuate that. And then we start all over again. The beauty of the budget is really the fact that it's a little cyclical in nature. As we get underway now that we have a new legislature, the governor's got 30 days from the beginning of session to deliver a budget recommendation to our legislative partners. And so we're well underway in terms of putting that together. We start that process with our departments and with the governor back in September or October in a traditional year, and thankfully we've been able to have a more traditional year this year. So we've been working with departments to set some priorities. Now we're working with our newly seated legislative partners to discuss some of their priorities and how those will factor into the governor's recommendation. But we're excited to be doing that. We've got a lot of opportunity ahead of us, and to be able to deliver for both the people of the state of Michigan, and then to deliver alongside our state employees and the departments that do the work all year long.
Yeah, great. I appreciate that. Kind of to pick up on something you said there, just about, legislative partnerships and things. We have a new trifecta of Democratic control here in Lansing, and kind of questions for our legislators here. Given this and these new majorities, what should we expect as the budget moves forward? I think we're kind of in the last 4 years, we've been used to the governor suggesting one thing and the legislature kind of proposing something else, and it kind of comes together at the end with some negotiation. Do you think that this, kind of trifecta scenario actually makes your job easier, or does it make it harder in some senses? And, what kind of differing priorities, like, is there things that you already know that there might be kind of differences on? Like, I really want this, but I really want this, and everything has a price tag, right? Especially in appropriations. And how do you kind of work to settle that and come together and still keep things very friendly and collegial? I don't know which of you want to start with that, but
this is the cool thing about having a trifecta is the values are aligned, right? Whether it was on the campaign trail, as many of us have been governing, our values that are centered in people-focused policies, things that uplift people, inclusion of all voices is something that is shared between the House, the Senate, and the executive. But we're not a monolith. And when you look at our chambers, both in the House and the Senate, they're made up of dozens of diverse voices from all corners of our state. And so you're going to have not differences in values, but differences in approaches and pace.
Okay.
So when you see maybe some conversations and negotiations, it isn't really a friction. It's more about the approach. But I think that those are really good problems to have instead of fundamental differences on how we fund things, the pace and the shape and scope of our policy. So that's why I think it's going to be awesome to have a trifecta, because it is not just about bickering around these big ticket, big issues. It is about how to bring our values to the forefront to make sure people's lives are enriched because we're here.
That's great, Senator. Representative, do you have anything to add there? Or?
The only thing I'd add is going back to what we started with. The reason that you won't see any of that is because we have strong relationships. There's a very strong relationship between myself and the chair in the Senate, Senator Anthony, and the governor and Director Harkins. So I don't think you'll see a lot of differences. We've knocked hundreds of thousands of doors. We are very aware of what the people in Michigan want, and we are here because the people asked us to get some things done. And I think we're all aligned on those issues, and we're going to focus on, lowering taxes and making sure people are taken care of in the state of Michigan.
Yeah. Okay, I appreciate that. Director Harkins, I'd like to kind of ask you the next question. And it's related to the balance sheet and just sustainability, I guess, if we want to phrase it that way. We continue to have leftover dollars on the balance sheet. We are talking about leftover federal COVID dollars, infrastructure dollars that remain on the books. Taken with those higher than forecasted revenues, there's, I think, a historic amount of about $7 billion still kind of out there on top of regular revenues. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But inflation has been the highest that it's been in 40 years. And economists are kind of talking about a cooling, if not a full recession, mid-2023, and questions about, whether that's going to be mild and how long or short it's going to be, of course. And U of M predicted at last week's consensus revenue estimating conference that tax revenues would decline $2.6 billion in fiscal year 2023 following the boom of the last 2 years. So long way of asking the question, which is, how do you plan for this? Because on one hand, there's historic opportunity, but then on the other hand, there's some troubling kind of things maybe in our sights in the future? And how do we ensure that whatever we're doing is sustainable for the long term?
It's really important for us, excuse me, as we talk about these things, we've got the structure set up correctly. We track our one-time and our ongoing spending differently. We know what those dollars look like, and we're spending accordingly. I think it's a lot like many of your businesses who do the same. As we look forward, we're planful, we're mindful about how we're spending these dollars, and when we're thinking through the cyclical nature of the budget itself. And Wendy, you're right. We've seen projections from folks at the University of Michigan that suggest a steeper decline over the next several years, and we had both the Treasury and the two fiscal agencies project milder recessions this for fiscal 23 when they discussed the consensus last week. So we're planning for how we might address those sort of shorter term downturns, but we also, as you point out, have a robust balance sheet right now that comes from carry forward from previous years as one-time monies, and we're expecting to be able to weather some of that potential recession with these sort of one-time dollars that we can use and buttress ourselves against some of these potential issues in the next year. But our ongoing revenues continue to look fairly strong. We've come through a pandemic. We've managed to continue to see projected growth year over year from 24 into 25, and we're still optimistic about what that looks like. And it allows us to continue to work with the legislature and figure out how we spend those ongoing revenues in meaningful and impactful ways for the citizens of the state.
Yeah, that's great. And in a future episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about priorities and kind of your individual priorities as it relates to the state budget and your caucus's priorities. But for this episode, we are out of time. So a special thank you to Representative Whitwer, State Budget Director Chris Harkins, and Senator Sarah Anthony for tuning in, for joining us today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to the My Business Matters Michigan Chamber podcast. Thank you and have a great day.